the sanctions actually work? This ties economics, politics, and IR together beautifully, from Russia to Iran to Zimbabwe. Are they effective? We're going to find out today. They're everywhere in today's headlines. You hear Russia to Iran, North Korea to Zimbabwe. You hear on the headline news, sanctions have been imposed on these countries. And you're wondering, okay, what are sanctions and do they really work? But this is the West's go-to punishment. Every time there's a trouble politically or in any form, sanctions are the first tools you see countries and actors in the international system employ. So these are punishments that they can use to make countries persuasive to follow like a policy or an agenda or do right, by everyone. So here's the big question. How symbolic are they? How effective are they? So we're going to be unpacking that in today's session, looking at how politics and economics work, in terms of sanctions as a tool. I am Dr. Dide Adewale, and welcome to my channel where we explore economics and international relations and see how they collide to shape the world we live in. So, sanctions are restrictions imposed by one country or group of countries on another, and this is to change behavior, without using military force. It's a kind of diplomatic tool that can be enforced without necessarily using aggression or military power or flexing military prowess. So sanctions can be economic, for example, international trade, which are the most common. Freezing of assets, you can see cutting of banks like maybe IMF Bank, World Bank, cutting of access to banking. It could also be individual through travel bans, visa denial, freezing of assets, and many more examples. So think of sanctions as the middle ground, between diplomacy and war. So what is the logic behind sanctions? It's a simple theory. You just make your targets, country's economy hurt. It's like telling off a country and trying to show that, I'll do this to you if you don't get that done, or I'll affect you this way if you don't get that done. And somehow this makes the country or the leader of that country to change course and comply with maybe policy especially, or what the agenda is on ground. So if you look at the US and the EU, they use sanctions to push aggression, like to stop aggression, to stop nuclear ambitions, or to check nuclear ambitions, or check human rights abuses. So sanctions are often, presented as a clean, bloodless tool of statecraft. Nobody's dying. Well, sometimes nobody's hurt. You're hurt, but it's not grave. It's not something that is endangering, or that is worse, like war crimes and all the war and all those artillery and stuff. So sanctions help you to change the course of direction. They're like a wheel to change the course of direction. So do they work now? Let's look at this case study. I'll say, let's pick the Ukrainian war. So after the 2022 invasion, of Ukraine, Russia, faced the toughest sanctions ever, cutting it from SWIFT, freezing, central bank assets, banning tech exports. That was huge. But the results, Russia's economy, shrank initially, but they adapted. So if you look at the history of economics and international relations, there is the countries adapt from time to time when issues come up. So this time around, Russia redirected trade and started negotiations with China, India, and the global south. Yeah, the sanctions hurt, but it didn't stop the war in this instance. Let's look at another example, the Iran nuclear program. So sanctions devastated Iran's economy, collapsing its currency, limiting oil exports. They pressured Iran into negotiating the 2015 nuclear deal. But what happened? When the US pulled out, Iran resumed nuclear activity. Proving sanctions can bring temporary compliance, but not permanent change. We're still answering the question. Yeah. Zimbabwe, that's another example. If you look at the case of the human rights and governance, sanctions targeted leaders, but ordinary citizens suffered the most. There was hyperinflation, like if there's any word that is higher than hyperinflation, unemployment and poverty deepened seriously. Critics argued sanctions weakened the economy, but that didn't change leadership behavior. It frustrated the people of that country and all the political systems in that country. So sanctions often hit civilians because that's one of the huge criticisms of sanctions. It makes things hard for civilians, and it's not really hard on the elites. It will raise food prices, cut medicine supplies, and worsen inequality. So when sanctions are used, the actors don't really suffer. It's the civilians, the people that actually feel the impact. Imagine the closing of borders, restrictions on certain products. It's the normal people like you and I that kind of suffer the kind of gets hit first before actually the political system or the system structure of whatever country that sanction is being imposed on. For example, in authoritarian leadership, sometimes they use sanctions to even consolidate power, and they blame the West for the economic pain. So it could also be manipulated. So globally, sanctions can fire back, pushing countries to create parallel systems. For example, the Russia and China developing alternatives to SWIFT. So when you think like you're blocking a road and you're trying to make people comply to your policy, they look for alternatives. So the economic and the political system of the world is such that when there's a problem, adaptability comes into place, alternatives comes into place, which makes sense because there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of excuse me, there's a lot of options and alternatives. If you think, countries decide to use their brain when they feel like, okay, there's no way out. They find alternatives. They get policies, analysts, think tanks, researchers to get alternatives to their present conditions. So what do you think about sanctions? Are they effective, in international relations? Despite the criticisms, do they work? Do they buy time? Or are they just a political theater for flexing? So drop your thoughts in the comment sections, and don't forget to subscribe for more weekly insights into the economics of power and the politics of money. Till I see you again, bye.